Hello, everybody. Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report. It's Thursday's edition, and we are broadcasting all over the country again today. Delray Beach, Florida, Lakeview, Texas, just outside the communist enclave of Austin, with my guest Richard Battle, and Mark's in studio in Irvine, California. Happy to have everybody with us today. Richard, every time you and I get together, we do about a half-hour show, and it can literally go on for 3 hours. There is insane stuff happening in this country and abroad. We have to start with the shocking story out of Maine, another mass killing. Unfortunately, this guy hasn't killed himself. He's still on the loose.
Well, yes, and while the pursuit of him is going on, and of course the investigation and what will come later, the one thing I think that people need to think about is the need to always be prepared to protect yourself, because the police, no matter how well we fund them, can never get there in time to stop a shooting. And so it's up to us as citizens to be prepared to protect ourselves, whether it's from a shooter or somebody hitting us when we're walking along the sidewalk or something else. And the public just has to be better prepared to reduce risk.
What galls me about this, 18 people are dead. You've already heard, it's like right on cue, certain Democrats coming out, gun control, gun control. This guy apparently was a trained weapons instructor, but apparently there were some warning signs. The guy apparently had some mental illness, and nobody spotted it, or they spotted it and did nothing.
Well, yes, and of course you have to have a mental illness to do something like this, and the investigation hopefully will show some of those type details. But again, to me, that we can't help that situation. We can't help the mentally ill person, whether they get a 2x4 or a baseball bat or a gun. We have to be vigilant in all of our activities and make sure that we do things to reduce our risk of being a prey from a predator.
Yeah, and I concur with you 100% there. Well, we wish the Maine police the best, and obviously grievance for the families. That's just a brutally difficult situation. Let's shift to politics here for a minute, and what I thought was an outstanding day yesterday with the elevation of Mike Johnson from Louisiana as House Speaker. But Republicans, if you could have put a dream candidate in there that checks every box, Mike Johnson would be it. And Richard, I thought his speech to Congress yesterday was eloquent, was Reagan-esque, and I could not be happier with the man the GOP has selected, to run Congress.
Well, I agree, and there's two things that I think is interesting to this point. One, I've seen this list of his 7 principles, and I wanted to translate it for the everyday voter. His principles are, and I'm going to read these: individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. A lot of Reagan in there, as I think you'd agree. And my translation for we everyday Americans is less government regulation, less government spending, stable rules for all, protecting America, lowering taxes, an opportunity to prosper for your family, and valuing life. And to me, that should be nonpartisan.
It sounds like it to me too, although already Democrats are taking shots at him, as is some people in the media. They're saying, well, he defended Trump on the election. So what? He's a lawyer. He's a trained lawyer, and a very good one at that. People are criticizing him because of his belief in God and his Christian background and his family. I mean, I got to tell you something. When I saw when he talked yesterday, he was unequivocally faith-driven, and it was so refreshing to see that. And his family, I could not be happier. I know it was a messy process how they made the sausage this time, but if you're a Jim Jordan fan, you got to be a Mike Johnson fan. This is really good news, Richard.
Well, I was really excited, and one word that drives me up the wall is the word denier when they talk about election denier. And of course, a lot of us remember the 2000 election that went on, I believe, about 37 days. But I went back after 2020 and examined the 1876 election. And that went on 115 days. And it was Tilden and Hayes. There were 5 states that were contested. It looked like Tilden was going to win all the way up to the last minute. And they ended up cutting a deal to end Reconstruction to get the South to vote for Hayes. And he won by 1 electoral vote. All of that was done through Congress, through the constitutional process. And most of what the Republicans wanted to do in 2020 was to contest certain results and have them adjudicated. The thing that really struck me at that time was the courts didn't seem to want to adjudicate the issue based on the merits. They seemed to want to dismiss it and not have to deal with it. And that enabled that election denier term to come into play. And of course, they used that to paint everyone who stood in that camp and paint them negatively when all they were doing was try to adjudicate and contest the results.
Well, I think Mike Johnson is going to be a tremendous speaker. He talked about doing appropriation bills. Said he would be the speaker for everybody. I mean, let's give Mike Johnson an A for starting out, Richard. And I'm in your camp too. I think we've got a good leader on our hands here, an articulate man, and someone that I think the entire caucus can get behind.
Yes.
Hey, let's talk about. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I just look forward to hopefully seeing the 12 appropriation bills and Congress getting back to using their power properly and having a federal budget for the first time since 1997.
No more ominous spending bills. We may need a continuing resolution every now and then, but we got to get regular order, 12 appropriation bills voted on, debated. I'm with you 100%. Yeah. Hey, let's turn to some good news that really has like a double-edged sword. A lot of people were surprised. U.S. GDP, gross domestic product, for the third quarter came out 4.9%. Richard, that's big-time growth, and people continue to charge the credit cards, exhaust savings. The government continues to spend ridiculously wild, and it all turned into a 4.9% GDP. You would think Wall Street would react positively. No, tech stocks are down about 500 points over the past 2 days. Interest rates are still hovering around 5%. Richard, 4.9% growth rate, most people kill for that number, but there's ominous warning signs out there. A lot of industries are starting to see slowdowns. What are your thoughts on this? Because normally 4.9, that's a nice number.
Well, the 4.9 number by itself is good. But if you had 4.9 and we had 2% or less inflation, and if interest rates were 2 or 3% versus 7 or 8% on new homes, that would be good as well. But with inflation and with the Fed increasing interest rates and with an increasing number of defaults and late payments on car loans, and with those increased interest rates, people being unable to afford as much home as they could before, those are all drags on the economy. And at some point, it's going to show up and we're going to have a recession or the economy is going to slow down, even that 4.9% number.
Yeah, a lot of people on Wall Street are echoing those thoughts. You could be looking at a recession in the U.S. in Q1 or Q2 of an election year. And I'm harkening back a long ways, and I've talked about it before, but if you have hostages and you have an economy in recession, you can kiss Joe Biden goodbye. I don't care how big the growth numbers are. It's interesting, Richard. Biden gets no credit for this growth. I mean, he's constantly out there touting Bidenomics. The DNC and their affiliated groups are spending millions of dollars in campaign ads, over a year before the election in swing states. Why is Biden getting no credit for the growth rate happening in this country? Is it because we're growing in spite of his policies?
Well, I think most people look at their paychecks and it's not keeping up with inflation. And when you go to the grocery store and buy a certain number of items and they cost you 20, 30% greater than it did a few months ago, or if you drive through the fast food restaurant and the prices are double what they were a year or so ago, gasoline for your car is higher, taxes in your local community for your home and schools are going up. all of these things are negative. And I think most people would take a stable expenses, which means low inflation, and increased paycheck over a flat paycheck and increased expenses, which is what Bidenomics is.
Yeah, I concur with you 100%. And again, part of the reason we grew 4.9 is because of outlandish government spending. You know, the consumer was 68% of that GDP. Government was 32. That's about a 1 point spread there from what it traditionally is. But if the government spending would just be normal, we could have had 2% GDP without all this inflation. But they just keep spending money. It's insane. But let me ask you this: good internationally. Let's talk about what's going on in Israel right now. Israel did basically a test run into Gaza. They're continuing to bomb the place to smithereens, taking out Hamas targets. Rockets landed in Tel Aviv. I mean, this is showing no signs at all of any type of let up. Palestinians are trying to leave the north, but they're being blocked by Hamas. I mean, it does seem like people are finally waking up to the fact that Hamas uses the Palestinians as human shields, and it's not really a debatable item anymore.
Well, yes, and what's really interesting is Israel has to fight Hamas on one end, and then on the other side, they've got to keep the U.S. from hobbling their efforts and threatening to take money away if they go too fast. And this whole idea of proportionality to me is so ridiculous. Whether it's a schoolyard fight or whether it's this situation, if you've got an issue, you want to take care of it as fast as possible with as minimal loss and damages to your side, and you want to win. And if that's your initial starting point, then how do you do that? What's important next? And this whole thing about waiting for certain approvals, to me, if Israel's ready, they ought to go and get it over with. And yes, there'll be collateral damage, but that should be on Hamas because they're the ones that are inhibiting people from leaving right now.
Yeah, they are. Now, Biden and Netanyahu have both come out, and both of them, to their credit, have said Israel will decide when Israel's ready to go. And apparently there are some advanced weapons systems arriving in Israel from the U.S. that will certainly help in that endeavor. And I believe what the Israelis are saying. When they're ready to go, they're going to go. And the U.S., despite at times the administration appear to holding them back, I really don't think that's the case. I think they've been given a green light, and when they're ready to go, I think they'll go. But Richard, one thing I want to talk about on the other side of the break when we come back, the relationship to Iran and who's really funding all this damage that's happening. Folks, we'll be back in about a minute, but first a message from our sponsor.
Banks are supposed to be the safest placeholders for cash in the world, but in 2022 that changed. The Federal Reserve pulled out $2.5 trillion of liquidity out of the banks, and the Fed also changed the requirements so banks don't need to keep any funds on hand. This means banks are starved for liquidity and have now become very dangerous places to hold your assets. Get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD at 720-605-3900. The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD, 720-605-3900.
All right, Richard, we're back. Listen, I think we really need to dive into what's happening with Iran here. The Biden administration has been, quote, warning Iran against involvement. And yet, Iran is launching rockets into U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria. And American soldiers are being injured, some pretty seriously. And yet, the Biden administration does nothing. I mean, Biden issuing a warning is sort of like the schoolyard bully who says, don't cross this line. Everybody crosses it, and he folds his arm and does nothing. What do you making this stuff with just the feeble attempt to influence the Iranians.
Well, Iranians are definitely behind all of this, and what's interesting with them doing nothing is Iranians are testing us, and if we don't respond, we can expect more aggression. And I liked the
Absolutely.
way Reagan would have responded or the way Trump responded, because Trump said, "You harm an American, you'll pay for it, period." And in the last 18 months, there were no Americans harmed around the world. The Homeland Security Department has warned American travelers, and they put out a global alert anywhere you're traveling, which to me says, don't expect the U.S. government to help you. And so that again is weakness. That's open season on all Americans around the globe. And Iran is going to, like a child, test the boundaries until they get pushback. And so to me, they need to be warned, and then we need to hit them and hit them hard to make them pay for that and stop.
Yeah, and it appears the Biden administration blinking at all. I don't even want to put Jake Sullivan in there. That man's a disgrace. Shouldn't even be in the White House. You know, when Trump left office, they had $4 billion in foreign reserves. Now they have 60. They were selling 400,000 barrels a day when Trump left office. Today it's 3 million. Most of that goes to China. Richard, this idea of appeasing the Iranians, I mean, have they learned nothing from 1979 to now? You know, I mean, it is astounding to me. Iran, forget what they've done with Israel. They've launched attacks on U.S. military bases in the Middle East, and Biden and Blinken and Sullivan and Lloyd Austin do nothing. I mean, folks, we're not advocating a war with Iran, but I got to tell you something, Richard. You knock those oil fields out, that's going to have a major implication for Iran. Now, they're probably calculating, well, if we do that, they're going to start, missiles into Israel. We could have a three-front war. You're going to end up with a three-front war anyhow. If you think the Iranians are going to stop because of this, you're out of your mind. And I believe if the U.S., does not take action, it will continue to be viewed as a sign of weakness. I hate reckoning back to it. My God, this is Jimmy Carter-esque, only worse.
Well, yes.
And I mean, look, we could go on and on about this, but when you have that type of reserves and you're not doing anything, and Richard, you know the Iranians are supplying Hezbollah with the rockets. I mean, folks, it just astounds me. I know there's, quote, geopolitical implications in this. Biden doesn't want to see oil prices skyrocket. He doesn't want to see a three-front war. Richard, if you were president, what would you do to the Iranians right now?
Well, first thing is, I think their naivete comes from a total misunderstanding of human nature, one. In 1988 is when I woke up, when the Iran-Iraq war went on, and I can't remember which one or both of them were doing it. They were clearing minefields with little children walking arm in arm across fields to clear minefields. They have no thought toward human life. And one of the ways, if we wanted to mimic what Reagan did to the Soviets in the 80s, we could mimic that by drilling for more oil, putting more U.S. oil on the world market, depressing prices, and that would drain their finances faster than anything we can do. And Reagan beat the Soviets in the Cold War by pencil whipping them economically, and we could do the same thing if we would just do it. But enabling them to raise more money and buy more weaponry, that just feeds their quest for global power.
Yeah, I totally concur with you. All right, let's go to the big FBI story here that Senator Grassley has opened up. 40 confidential sources making reference to the Biden crime family, and the FBI and the Justice Department do nothing? I mean, Richard, this story stinks, and it gets worse every day.
Yes, and I think at some point, and I hope we'll end up with both houses after the election next year, there needs to be an investigation and a total reorganization of the FBI, because to me, there's enough rot throughout, because even if people weren't involved with corruption, there's been too many people stand by and let it happen and not speak up. And so we need to change the environment totally to where that agency is purely law enforcement and non-political again, so we can have credibility with it. Because right now I have no trust in that agency.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, if Grassley is correct, and there's 40 confidential sources, tying the Biden family, James and Hunter, to Joe. I mean, and evidence keeps trickling out. I mean, I don't know what it's going to take. I concur with you. I mean, it is troubling at the least to see this happening. And the only logical conclusion you can say it's because we've got a Democratic president and it's political. I don't know. That's about the only explanation I can come from. Speaking of politics, and this is a sensitive subject I'm getting ready to bring up here. Do you think liberal Jews will finally give up on the Democratic Party after seeing the just blatant anti-Semitism of the hardcore left of the Democratic Party? I mean, I get it if you your whole life you've been voting for Democrats, but after you see the way the far left wing of this party's reacted, how could you, as a liberal Jewish person, vote for a Democrat? It's perplexing to me.
Well, I think that we think about the Jewish faith as much like others. There's conservative Orthodox Jews and the spectrum across to the liberal Jews. And what it says to me is some of them don't care as much about their Jewish heritage as they do their political affiliation and the liberalism of being part of the Democrat Party. And so the ones that are really the liberals, I don't think will change, because having the ability to get abortion and some of the other liberal issues to them are much more important than being Jewish.
Yeah, that could be the case. Well, we'll see how that support comes out as we head into 2024. But speaking of politics, what do you make of that? I'll just call him a clown, that Jamal Bowman, that idiot that pulled the fire alarm in the house to try to delay a vote. I mean, what the hell was this guy thinking when he did that? He pled guilty yesterday to a misdemeanor. I mean, what do you make? I mean, it's astounding some of the stupidity you see.
Well, the first thing is, and again, this shows human nature all the way back to Adam and Eve. When he was caught red-handed with video evidence, he denied it. He did not initially admit to his guilt. And if he just said, yes, I did it and I was trying to do X, I think the response would have been a little differently. But I still think he's going to get off with a slap on the hands despite that, and despite the seriousness of it. And of course, here you have the people on the January 6th, some who did less than that, who got multiple months or years in prison. And here this guy does this, but because of his party affiliation, is going to get off almost scot-free.
Yeah, it's just astounding what you're saying. And speaking of politics, I mean, what did you make of Gavin Newsom, governor of California, heading over to China with the delegation, the size of California, meeting with President Xi, firmly talking about the allegiance between the state of California and China. And, with all the problems Joe Biden is in, Richard, is this an audition for 2028, or does he really think that Biden's going to stumble badly enough that the Democratic Party will turn to Gavin Newsom?
Well, I'm of the belief that Biden will not be the candidate in November 2024 and have been for a long time. It's just a matter of how and when we get to that point. And I think Newsom is trying to be primed to be that person when the time comes. He wants to be that person and be anointed, if you will, as that person. Going to China to get his bona fides, if you will. But to me, with all the things going on to China, did he pick that country to go to versus some others who he could use as we're going for business relations between India and California, or some other issues that he could increase his foreign experience without going to probably the number one potential target of our adversaries, if you will. And so it was not only the international travel, but which country he picked and why that to me is worthy of questioning.
What's interesting, you have to think about it from Xi's perspective. Here is a sitting U.S. governor meeting with a head of state, him flying over, the photo opportunity. Again, from an optics point of view, despite politically what I think about it, I thought it was fairly effective. I mean, here you have a U.S. president who a large percentage of the public believe to be senile and cognitively challenged and really not up to the job. And you have this young, vigorous, good-looking, slick presentation that from a Democratic Party perspective looks pretty good. Now, from my position, being on the right side as you are, I'd rather see whoever our nominee is go against Joe Biden. I mean, I think might say, well, Mark, you're not going to be sitting president like that. Well, given it's Joe Biden, and Richard, I hate doing this, but the comparisons to Jimmy Carter, 40 years later, 43 years later, it's astounding. I mean, both of them had a bad economy. Both of them are dealing with hostages. Both of them were weak on foreign affairs. Didn't use the military. I mean, there are a lot of ties between the two. Now, Carter was a lot smarter than Biden is. I mean, I gave him that. He was a nuclear scientist. But am I missing something here, or are you seeing the same thing as I'm seeing?
Well, first thing is Joe Biden makes Jimmy Carter look like George Washington. And the second thing is Xi over in China, I'm sure one of the things they were checking on was whether they needed to open up another accounts payable account for Gavin Newsom and how to route checks and things of that nature for future business dealings that they might have, and whether they could do something similar as they have done in the past with the Biden family, and whether they had to add expenses or they could replace Biden expenses with Newsom expenses. So that would have been interesting to see all of those discussions as well.
Well, Richard, I got to tell you, we're at the end of the show. I want to thank you again for joining me today. Again, every time you're on, just massive amounts of news. And I'll close it out with this, folks. If the people who ran the Bud Light commercials didn't learn it before, UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship, they get Bud Light as the sponsor, and people are already calling for boycotts and cancellation. When are these companies going to learn their lesson? Anyhow, that's it for Schaftlein Report today. Thanks for viewing. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on Tuesday. Have a great weekend and stay safe, everyone.